Can we turn? So, continuing with our series Recalibrate. And we've been talking about how on this journey we're all pilgrims, all on a journey. And it can be easy along the way to get distracted. That's why we need to recalibrate and we need to focus on regain our life priorities around what God's path is for us. Now, a place for me doing this growing up was on camps, on Christian camps. And to start with, I was actually a little bit late to the party. So my parents sent me to my first camp when I was in grade 7, and I was a bit unsure what I was stepping into. I had no friends going along. I didn't really know anyone there. And for those that know the Northwest, Smithton was about an hour's drive from where we lived, so I was really out in the sticks and had no idea what I was in for. I was certainly a bit worried what my parents had dropped me at. But soon after I got introduced to my cabin leader and got to know them, I actually started to see there's a lot of good fun here. We had the water slide, we had flying fox, we went out in the bush, a lot of great things. And some of those things I was a bit worried about, like, that would just be like Bible. This was my view when I first thought about youth group, was that it was just going to be a whole lot of kids around a table reading the Bible. And to me, I was like, that sounds pretty boring. I don't really want to do that. But I discovered, actually, there's some exciting things here. And actually, the studies when we went to chapel were interesting. And seeing these other Christians, these other cabin leaders showing, their passionate faith was really something that sparked for me. And I kind of came away from that going, I want to do that again. But realising that was probably the last camp I could go to. But of course, the leader I had, and one of the best times was just at night sharing the stories and discussing, hearing or having our answers, having our questions answered. And so this leader said, look, you can come back next year in a leadership role as a junior cabin leader. And it just sparked from there that I ended up nearly every school holidays heading off to camp to help lead. And that sparked for my brother and sister and people from our church all got involved. And so I was a little bit sad when I came to Hobart and found they didn't quite have that same culture. I don't know, who here went to camp growing up, went to a camp? Yeah, about 50% of the room, over at Mornington. I remember what it's like, but I know Nick and I have had a few conversations around how can we have this culture, because going to camps is so important for our lives. I actually had, again, talked about Mitch, because our youth leaders know that I've been encouraging them to get along to a camp. And Mitch said to me once, he said, so what's the benefit, Dan? Why do you think we need to do this? And I think from my own experience, just seeing other passionate people declaring their faith, coming alongside young people and having that opportunity to share into someone else's life, and in some ways an understanding of your own faith. It made me want to know more about why I believed in Jesus and followed him. It really sparked something for me, which led me to actually reading more and focusing more on my devotional time. And through reading, wanting to read the Bible in a year, I found the festival that we're going to be talking about today, the Festival of Sukkot. And it might look, for most, when you read it, it seems, why is it in the same bracket as these other, as the three pilgrimage festivals, as the Passover and the receiving of the Torah? It's a bit ordinary. But I think for me, knowing the importance of camps and getting outdoors, it really spoke to me. So let me introduce this Festival of Sukkot. You may have also heard it as the Festival of Tabernacles, the Festival of Booths, shelters or in-gathering. And we read about it in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus, which I popped up the links on the Bible app, which you can access on your phone. Just go to events and go Citywide, and you can read more of the description there. But in summary, it basically is, as we have the Passover talking about this escape from Egypt and God breaking the Israelites out of slavery, and the Festival of Weeks looking at the Torah and then giving these rules and commands. The Festival of Sukkot is a week-long autumn festival celebrating or commemorating the 40 years journey for the Israelites through the wilderness. like the other two, they experience this. The festival is about people experiencing what they would have felt like as they went through the desert, went through the wilderness for 40 years. It's just jammed into one short week, but I'm sure just one day in a tent is enough to get the feeling, eh? The point is to live in a temporary structure, and these are actually built with branches and leaves around 3 of the sides, leaving one side exposed. And the Israelites were to lodge or to stay in that during that week as the festival, the last harvest for the year, and really, I guess, commemorating the last agricultural harvest for the year is what this ceremony is about. And we can see it recorded and observed by Solomon, Hezekiah, and Ezra when they returned from exile. So as I mentioned, it's about these coincide with the harvest seasons. The Passover was the spring harvest, the Baileys weeks is the summer harvest with the wheat and grain, and Sukkot is the autumn harvest. So really it's the fruit, it's the picking up the fruit at the end of the season, the grapes, the figs. It's being thankful for the year that you've had with the harvest. So why is this festival important? Why is it held as important as the other two when it seems on the surface like it doesn't hold the same weight? Well, the Festival of Sukkot, what it does is it challenges our willingness to step into the wilderness with God. And I want to pause here because I've come to know that my definition of wilderness is a little bit different to others, or maybe the value of it anyway. See, in the dictionary, wilderness is described as an unsettled, uncultivated region, a barren, desolate area, a wasteland. And I like this one, sometimes characterised by bewildering vastness. A state of neglect, powerlessness, or disfavour. And I think sometimes I relate that to kind of a state of mind, isn't it? Sometimes we feel powerless, we feel in the wilderness. And I think 2020 was one of those years where a lot of people felt in the wilderness with mental health. So I agree with that meaning of wilderness, but where I differ is the purpose, the opportunity that we gain from going into the wilderness. So, because why is the wilderness important? The Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance said this: wilderness areas are important because they provide long-term protection from the last of our nation's wild landscapes. They are places that possess spectacular beauty. This one. They offer outstanding solitude. They support native animals and plants. They protect valuable water resources. They shelter ancient cultural artifacts. They provide opportunities for primitive recreation. And they maintain a resilience in the face of global climate change. Some say bewildering vastness. I say outstanding solitude. When I get into the wilderness, it gives me a sense of adventure, of discovery, that there's stuff out there to be discovered, and certainly a sense of wonder of God's creation. And for me, the wilderness is a place where I can dwell with God. It's like, again, for me, it's like being back in the Garden of Eden, again, walking and talking with God. And He wants to walk with us. But as I suggested in this series, there's many times that we feel pressure or stress or even the comforts of this world that keep us from actually entering into that space with God. This is the experience of Israel. Like for me, going on that first camp, there's a bit of fear as to what I'm stepping into, a bit of the unknown of what is actually going to happen. But when we overcome that, we actually see and have an opportunity to have an amazing time with what God has planned for us. Between leaving Egypt and reaching the Promised Land, the Israelites lived in these tents, in these temporary structures in the wilderness. And they were on a pilgrimage through this wilderness, which gave them the opportunity to learn about the character of God. And when I was in my late teens, I came across, as I mentioned, reading the Bible, and you're getting through Deuteronomy, Numbers. Sometimes it's a bit hard reading, but a particular passage stood out to me, particularly around being in the wilderness and dwelling with God, seeking God's guidance. And it's Numbers 9:15 to 23. I just want to read it here. It's called The Cloud Above the Tabernacle. One day, the tabernacle the tent of the covenant law was set up. The cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. That is how it continued to be. The cloud covered, and at night it looked like fire. When the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Whenever the cloud settled, they stopped. They encamped. At God's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command, they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. When the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days. At the Lord's command, they would encamp. And then by his command, they would set out. Sometimes the cloud stayed only for the evening till morning, and when it lifted in the morning, they set out. Whether by day or by night, whenever the cloud lifted, they set out. I think there's a theme here. Am I catching a bit of a theme? Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days or a month or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out. But when it lifted, they would set out. My teenage self got the point. When God moves, you move. When God stays, you stay. And the point here is that God wants us to be in step. He wants to be walking with us. He wants us to consider when we are to move and when we are to stay. Now, Renata last week reminded us that through Pentecost, we have the Spirit with us to do that, to help us in guiding us through. But we also get many examples of Jesus, where he would go off into the wilderness to pray. We have, of course, the 40 days in the wilderness, where Jesus spent time with his Father, understanding what it was that he was to achieve here on earth. And he dwelt with his Father there. I added in the notes on the Bible app, Mark 1, 35 to 39, where it's basically Jesus has started his ministry, he's doing all this amazing work, and the disciples are like, hey, look at this, look at what we're doing. And Jesus, that when he gets up, he goes to the wilderness to pray. Once his disciples find him, they ask, what are you doing? Come on, let's keep doing what we're doing. And Jesus goes, no, I need to move on. I need to move forward with what God has planned. So we see even Jesus, he spent time with his Father knowing when he was to get up and move and when he was to stay. How often do we recognise the Lord wanting to dwell with us? I remember Gus one time doing a communion talk where he reminded us that we're human beings, not human doers. That we're to be. Do we go where we feel we're commanded to go? And do we stay when we have a sense that the Spirit is asking us to stay? Are we willing to step into the wilderness and to step out of our comfort zone into uncomfortable situations? And I can tell you, it's hard. It's actually a really hard thing to do. It's been 12 years since I read that passage, and I just went, God, I want you to do that with my life. I was just fascinated by what would it be like to have people that took this seriously, that wanted to just move when God said to move and stay when God said to stay, and to spend time in the wilderness to reflect on this. Like I said, that was 12 years ago, and I feel like I'm still only getting to the starting line with the Blue Gum Pilgrim stuff. We've been defining what the pilgrim is through the series, so I don't think I need to say more about that. But the Blue Gum aspect of why I've been putting this together, the Blue Gum Pilgrim stuff together, comes from my natural environment and wilderness studies that I did at UTAS. And through that course, it really opened my eyes as I reflect on that and with the Bible of how Jesus used a lot of parables to connect with the people in that land. And I thought, hey, there's actually a lot of great examples from our bush that we can relate to. And particularly, I've revised John 15, one of the passages that also spurs me on and I'm really passionate about. It may sound a little bit different to what's in your Bible, but so this is Jesus talking to his disciples, and he says, I am the true blue gum, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no gum nuts, while every branch that does bear gum nuts, he prunes, so that it will grow even more fruit, will be even more fruitful. Remain in me as I remain in you. No branch can bear gum nuts by itself. It must remain in the blue gum. Neither you can bear gum nuts unless you remain in me. I am the blue gum, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. When, apart from me, you can do nothing. So when I'm planning these bushwalks and labelling it a Blue Gum Pilgrim Bushwalk, I have this in mind of how can we relate to what we're doing on this walk, how can we have a moment of listening to what God has for us and helping us move forward in what He wants us to move forward in. At least that's my goal. I feel like I actually really get to that because at the same time I feel God saying, okay, just to go on these walks, to listen to the conversation and I just love how a lot of the conversations have been around getting to know what each person's journey is. As we go on these walks together, we learn a little bit more about the journey people are on. I have a book here that got given to me. It says Socrates, all I know is that I know nothing. And in there I've written down all the times where I felt God say something along the lines of this Blue Gum Pilgrim, of what I should be doing. And it just helps me to know and focus on what it is that the journey that I'm on, that I'm taking that next step towards. But as I said, it can be really hard, and I've learnt from this that it's a lot easier when you're not doing it alone. It's a lot easier when you do actually take that time out to sit with God and to listen to what He has to say. So I want to encourage you. It may not be, the bush might not interest you, but I'm sure there's something that God has laid on your heart that you're passionate about. And I want to encourage you to get people around you. I want to encourage you to spend some time out listening to what it is the Lord wants you to do next with that. I'm so thankful for people like Mark Johnson and Steve and Jess who have encouraged me and the people that enjoy getting out in the bush with me. And even for Pastor Matt, who has been saying, all right, once a month you're to organise a bushwalk and to help me to push me to that next step. Now, God took all of Israel into the wilderness. They didn't do it alone. And that was so they could experience His character, so they could reshape the nation. It is something that you don't need to do alone. And this festival actually encourages us to spend a week with others and out of our comforts with God together. So I've got that point that God wants to lead us in the wilderness. He wants us to be willing to step into that. I just want to finish with a few verses and a story about the fact that we are a temporary structure, or that life is like a temporary structure. I called this sermon the tent life. What happens when we stay in a tent? When it gets hot, it gets hot. You don't really sleep in. When it gets wet, you want to feel dry. And when you have kids with you, you can lose your sanity. it can be all squeezed in there. But at the same time, you have these moments, don't you? You have these moments, and I was reflecting on, actually, as the Pods group, we went last July camping in Coles Bay. And I thought Coles Bay is my favourite place in Tassie. It's going to be awesome. We forgot about the July part, that it was winter. I was like, surely the East Coast doesn't get too cold, does it? Well, the first night was beautiful. It actually was a nice night, the first night. But then it got cold. It was very cold. I don't think we could have got any closer to the fire. But also, during that time, I had a really special time with my girls that they wanted to go fishing. They wanted to have this experience of going fishing. And so we managed to find a jetty, and of course we caught nothing. But it was a beautiful afternoon. The sun was setting, the mountains were looking glorious, and we just shared this awesome moment together of in this tent life of going out into this situation. But of course it comes to an end, and you go home and you go back to your comforts. Last week, Kim Valentine, who took Vicky Jordan's funeral, reminded us all that we're all tent people. But this is not our home. You see, the festival, this being the last harvest of the year, and another important factor is, as we've mentioned before, that each festival has a reading with it. The Passover was, of course, the Exodus story. The Festival of Weeks is the preceding Torah. Well, this one is Ecclesiastes. And I think Ecclesiastes is a book that everyone needs to read because his big point is hevel, everything is hevel. Life is like chasing after the wind. He's saying meaningless. Everything seems meaningless. It seems like chasing after the wind. And he says this 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Hevel, everything is hevel. Life is temporary and fleeting. The teacher goes on through many ways of saying it, investing in money, investing in even some ways wisdom and purpose, can, if it's apart from God, it's meaningless. The book affirms that celebrating Sukkot, in celebrating Sukkot, when it says in chapter 3, verse 12 and 13, there's nothing better for man than to be happy and to do good while they live, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in his toil, but this is a gift from God. Then later says, so I saw that there is nothing better for man than to enjoy his work, because that is his lot. He's saying to be present in what you're doing. When we're in a tent, we seem to be better at accepting the environment around us, the elements that is happening. We just make do. We seem to be better at accepting that we have no control over those things. And we live life with a greater freedom and enjoyment. I think God certainly has a big sense of humour, because he really wanted to test me on this morning. As I mentioned, we've had so many different technical issues, and so I've been back and forth between the two. It's out of my control. I can't do anything about it. But I can control how I feel about it. And I continue to just pray, God, look, this is in your control, this is in your hands. I found it interesting. I got here at Mena Valley in good time, but if I was a few seconds later, I noticed as I came over the bridge, the cars piling up that closed the bridge. So if I was a few seconds later, I probably would have been much later. Yeah. But it's all in God's control. So there's nothing I can do. Peter and Paul wanted to add to this idea of tent life. Peter asserting that in this life, so summarising when he talks about it in his letter, he's saying that basically in his death he'll be throwing off the tent, that he'll be going home. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, he's declaring that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom, that he will move from mortality to immortality. We journey through this life in a temporary body, ready to go home to our immortal bodies. And a lot of time, this kind of conversation can be difficult too. It's not an easy one to have. People don't really want to talk about death and what happens next. But at the end of the Festival of Sukkot, the branches over that week have died off. As I said, the book of Ecclesiastes reminds people of how brief the time on earth is. Yet, through this festival, God commands us to rejoice. It says in Deuteronomy 16:14, be joyful at your festival. This is a joyful festival to celebrate the fact that all things will come to an end, that we are going to die. The interesting thing about this festival is that it runs for 8 days. It starts at the Sabbath, and as I mentioned, we're going to talk more about the Sabbath next week. And then goes for a week, you get to the next Sabbath, and then there's an extra day on the end where you no longer need to be in a temporary structure. You can celebrate at home. And this is a picture of the fact, again, that we are on this journey through life. And there's a day where we are going to be home. Paul, after talking to the Thessalonian church about the day of the Lord and what to expect when we're moving from our temporary shelter to eternity, he left them with these instructions. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. I want to invite up Sam and Emily to play our last song. And for us to reflect in this time, as we'll come back and then have communion. But this joy celebration is to remind us of God's guidance, his faithfulness in the wilderness, and as we dwell with him here and as we are to dwell with him here on earth as we are in eternity. So I want to listen to these words of this next song, and then I'm going to come back and lead us all in